passage you read, by the way, I used to be, many years ago, I was the publicity secretary of the Labour Party at Edinburgh University. I always find it amusing that people accuse me of being far right. It just shows you how much society has changed. And I remember going to arrange an event with my Scottish nationalist equivalent. And I went into his room, and on his wall was a poster, "Let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never failing stream." And I said, "Are you a Christian?" And he laughed and he said, "Yeah, are you?" I said, "Yeah, I am." He said, "Okay, first deal. We're not doing an event on a Sunday, okay?" I said, "Yeah, absolutely." And it was just very interesting to see the level of people involved. Because of time limit and all the rest of it, I'm talking about paradise lost. I'm trying to talk about something that I think is hugely important, and I think it's becoming a key issue. It's funny, we were just talking before a couple of issues, climate change, a big issue, gender stuff's a big issue. I think the role of law in society is, I would argue, is going to be the biggest issue, if it's not already the biggest issue in Western society today. And that's a big claim, and I want to explain why I think that is the case. For the benefit of lay people like me, I want to just summarize some basic points about why this is so important. What is the rule of law, for example? It's a little bit one of those questions you think, oh yeah, we know what law is, but that's like saying, yes, we know what time is. Well, try and explain time. It's actually very difficult. And the rule of law, the simplest explanation I come to is governance of a society through laws which apply to both rulers and ruled. And that is very important. Why is it important? Well, I'll give you one example. 1.5 billion of the world's urban poor live in informal settlement and slums without any right to their own property. It is their own property, but it can just be taken from them. A while ago in City Legal, we had someone speaking about a situation in PNG. In sub-Saharan Africa, it is estimated that the majority of the population live without any real property rights. And you say, well, why does that matter? It matters enormously. For lots and lots of different reasons. It also matters this because there are essentially two options within a society. You can have tyranny, or you can have the rule of law. You can have the rule of the strong man or strong woman, or you can have the rules that apply for all. In terms of a book by Samuel Rutherford, the Scottish Presbyterian minister, which some people believe is one of the key founding documents for the United States. As I've said before, anything that's good in the world, we claim that Scots invented. Anything that's bad, we claim others. So we were claiming that we'd invented America, but sometimes we're going to withdraw that claim, I think, at some point. But he wrote a book called Lex Rex, The Law is King. And it was to answer Rex Lex, the king is the law. And he ended up, losing his life because of it. He ended up dying just before he was due to be executed. My view is that if we do not have the rule of law, we will revert to some form of tyranny. It won't. I don't think it will be a strongman, Putin type, Xi Jinping type tyranny. I think it will be liberal progressive tyranny, which is more insidious and perhaps also more dangerous. Number 4, morality and justice are intrinsic to the very nature of law. It was Augustine who pointed out that an unjust law would appear to be no law at all. So justice is hugely, it's a presupposition that we would have about justice. So if you ever, do a talk on law or anything like that, people will show scales, the scales of justice and all the rest of it. So what is justice? We talked today about social justice warriors. I find it quite interesting because I'm not sure that they are warriors. I'm not sure that they know what social or justice is. But we use justice all the time. We say, is this just? Well, what does that mean? Morality and justice are intrinsic to the very nature of law. From a Christian perspective, I also want to say that the Bible has an enormous amount to say about justice, a huge amount. And I think, for example, you can take the prophets in the Old Testament. If you like, they're the original social justice warriors or free speech warriors. I find it intriguing today that in most of the Western world, our prophets are not your radicals. They're not radical at all, because the inverted commas, the radicals supposedly are the ones who are in control of things. Our prophets, and sadly, our prophets are not often people within the church or church leaders who seem to bend over backwards to be as accommodating as possible to the culture and environment. But it's rather bizarrely people like Douglas Murray, gay atheist, or Jordan Peterson, or Lionel Shriver, or somewhat even more bizarrely, Germaine Greer. I never in my life thought I would be on the same side as Germaine Greer, but increasingly I find myself in that position. What does the Bible have to say? Matthew 22:21 says this: give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. It's a fundamental that changed the whole of human society. Why? Because the Greco-Roman pagan world made no distinction between what we would now call church and state. And the idea of the separation of religion, the family religion, the city religion, from the polis, the government, the politics, the governance of the society, was an unheard of one. And Christianity made that. I think we are actually reverting back to a Greco-Roman pagan view, and basically the state says everything is ours. And that's where law comes in here. Just to let me mention, I've literally got hundreds of verses. So some of them: Leviticus 19:15, do not pervert justice, do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. If anything destroys identitarian politics, it's that, or identitarian justice. When someone says you have to find in my favor because of my gender, or because of my sexuality, or because of my race, or because of my class, although that's increasingly less likely in today's world, a judge will say no. A judge will say, hang on a minute, I may like you, I may belong to your club, but I'm looking at the evidence, I'm looking at what's involved. Don't show partiality, don't pervert justice. Proverbs 17:15, acquitting the guilty and condemning the innocent, the Lord detests them both. Isaiah 1:17, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed. How do you defend the oppressed? If you live in an unjust society, it's the oppressors who win. Defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. Amos 5, we read the passage, but I'll just emphasize a couple of the verses. For I know how many are your offenses and how great are your sins. There are those who oppress the innocent and take bribes and deprive the poor of justice in the courts. Amos 5:15, hate evil, love good, maintain justice in the courts. And then I mentioned already, let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. That passage, by the way, Amos, away with the noise of your songs, I will not listen to the music of your harps. That's a passage in which God is really saying, I actually don't care if you worship me or how you worship me, if you're not going to do this, if you're not going to have justice. Now, I would argue, taking all that in background, I would argue that our society is fundamentally, and we can question this if we want, but I think it can be demonstrated, is fundamentally built upon a Judeo-Christian ethic, particularly the legal aspect of it. I think the rule of law as we have it has taken hundreds, perhaps even thousands of years to build up, but it can be taken away. And my view is it's going to be taken away. And it's only when it's taken away that we'll realize it's gone. And when it's gone, it's like when you lose your health, it will take a long time to get it back. And I do think that the key event, this absolute significant event, is the Magna Carta in 1215. And the history of the Magna Carta is really important. It was drawn up by Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And it was drawn up in response to, there had been a number of kings who had professed Christianity And then King John came along and, inverted commas, professed Christianity, but he was cruel and he was oppressive. And the barons and so on, in effect, rose up against him. And Langton, King John did not, he wanted him to stay in France. He did not want him to come back to England, but he came. And the Magna Carta is a fascinating document, which was eventually signed and really became the basis of law in Western liberal democracies since then. And there's a fascinating thing that you can do. You can take the basic principles of the Magna Carta, and then you can find the Bible verses on which they're based. And it works really well. So I'm not, as I say, I don't have the time to do that, but let me just list some of the things. Rulers must appoint competent and fair judges. The king is not above the law. The church should be free. The rights of habeas corpus, banning arbitrary detention and providing for trial by jury. No one is to be convicted without credible witnesses or credible proof. Proportionate justice. So, for example, it was made illegal to remove someone's livelihood as a means of punishment. Again, I just think that's a hugely significant thing. The equality of all before the law. Standard measures in terms of weights and measures. In other words, justice in trade. Private property was to be respected, and kings have to get consent for taxation. All that was in the Magna Carta, and there's more as well. Now, as I say, I'm prepared to argue that that is largely based upon biblical standards of justice, and that's largely been the basis upon which justice in liberal democracies and those they have influenced has been based. Let me suggest why I think there are signs of danger in this. First of all, simply this. I think freedom of religion is the first freedom, and I think that is gradually being eroded. Freedom of religion leads to freedom of association, freedom of speech, education, freedom of the press, marriage, property, the right to life, bodily integrity, and so on. I would also suggest this, that where there has been the most impact of the Bible, there are governments which are more respectful of human rights and the rule of law and least prone to tyranny. I remember the Ghanaian ambassador to the UK writing me, thanking me for an article that I'd written defending the Ghanaian president who'd visited Scotland and had been treated abominably by some of our politicians. I regarded it as racist, actually, because, and he wrote me and said, I'm so grateful for what you wrote, and I need you to understand that we are trying to build, he said, people treat us here with contempt, but we are going to be in the top 10 economies in the world fairly soon. And people think that we're backwards, but we're trying to build a country that is based on biblical principles. And I was so glad to read that. Where do I think the dangers are? The politicization of the judiciary, which leads to what in Stalin's Russia was called telephone justice, where Stalin would pick up the phone and say, this is the result I want. An independent judiciary is so important because they can give judgments that the government don't like. And we've just had a situation in Scotland where the government lost a court case. And I was so delighted to see that. I think there are dangers of the politicization of the judiciary. I think there's danger, and we're seeing this in Australia just now, of trial by media and trial by mob. And forget the need for witnesses. It's how do they look? What's the perception? One of the things that really bothers me, that has actually this has really shaken me. You're innocent until you're proven guilty. That is rapidly being changed into you're guilty until proven innocent. And that's incredible. People say, what do you think about, Christian Porter, for example? I'm good. I don't know. I haven't seen the evidence. I don't know. I said, do we have a justice system here or not? You say, oh, well, that's because you're whatever. I said, no. That's true of actually anybody. We need to be incredibly careful about declaring people guilty on the basis of media reports or of gossip. That's the whole point of a justice system. I've recently been reading a rather bizarre but wonderful book by a lawyer called Ian Mitchell, called The Justice Factory. He manages, he goes all over the place. He talks about justice in 1920s and 1930s Russia, but he also talks about, he's got a wonderful section at the end, which is more or less, ends up being half the book as an appendix, about justice in the West and in Scotland in particular. And I just want to finish by giving you just a couple of quotes, which I found really, really helpful. So about a century ago, a man called Dicey described an administrative state as one in which there are laws to protect the governing elite from the people, whereas in a free society, laws exist in part to protect the people from the elite. I think we're moving towards an elitist society where the laws protect the governing elites from the people. A Rechtsstaat, it's a German word, it's a very important idea. It's a state which is ruled through law rather than being ruled by it. And that again is a fundamental change that is occurring, being ruled through law rather than by it. I think when Tony Blair first came to power in the United Kingdom, in the first year, there were 10,000 new laws that were passed. Governments think they can do everything by law. Passing more laws than the judiciary can make proper use of is how this Rechtsstaat idea approach to government. The principle is basically this: since the people cannot safely be left to their own devices, there should be a law for everything. And of making many laws, there just is no end. So you guys who are lawyers, in one sense, it's great. In another sense, it's not, because you end up just being administrators. A computer could do what a lot of people say could be done. A true Rechtsstaat has to have its own police force to control its, imposing its own morality on them. The traditional British concept of citizen control of the parish constable is inadequate if morality, values, and state interests are to be successfully controlled by the center. That's what I mean by the state replacing God. Morality, values, all imposed from the state. A guy called Nikolai Kirilenko, a Russian guy, in The Judiciary of the USSR, fascinating book, 1923, has been translated into English, says this. This is an amazing quote. The court is a weapon for safeguarding the interests of the ruling class. A club is a primitive weapon. A rifle is a more efficient one. The most efficient is the court. I think we're in danger of heading that direction. Let me just finish by saying, Peter standing, that's always a good sign. It means my time is done. But ultimately, we only get justice in this world if we believe in the ultimate judge. And we need to think about personal stuff about innocent and guilty and morality and everything else that comes from that and what that judge will think of us. But that's an even more important issue that maybe we'll look at another time. But I hope that is enough to get you going.
Oh, thank you very much, David. David's given us a lot to think about. In a moment, we're going to pass over to Nick Aroney, Professor of Constitutional Law from the University of Queensland. So, Nick, you might want to just unmute yourself, and if you're happy to put your video on, and then we'll cross to you and get your comments, and then we'll move to questions. We've already got some questions coming in, so please feel free to text them or use the chat function at the base of the Zoom screen, and they'll come through to me. So here we are. Okay, welcome. I'll just let you make a few comments. You might need to unmute yourself, and I'll leave you in the hands of our IT team.
Nick, are you stunned into silence? He's cut. He can.
Just while we're waiting, Nick, if there's any questions you want to write down.
Sorry about that. I unmuted myself and then I muted myself and then it wouldn't let me unmute again. So apologies for that.
Okay, away we go.
And thank you for this opportunity. And thank you, David, for your talk, which was very stimulating and got me thinking in too many directions at once. So the thoughts that I have are very much off the cuff. But the first thing that occurs to me is this: the question whether the rule of law is self-sustainable. Or let me rephrase that. The question whether the ideal of the rule of law is self-sustainable. And I would say that, consistent with David's argument, the answer to that is that it is not. I think that we have been working through the implications over the last few hundred years of an idea that we can construct our societies and develop our laws and rely on constitutions that depend on the idea of the rule of law, and in particular the concept that law consists of rules, and that if we just get the rules right, and if we build up a system of rules that controls power, it will have somehow a capacity to maintain what we value about the rule of law. And secondly, we have put a lot of trust in the idea of the separation of powers, because we recognise that perhaps good laws, good rules, or a good constitution might not be enough. And so we have the view that we derive from Montesquieu, as well as James Madison and others from the American founding, that perhaps we ought to then just create counterpowers and a separation of powers, so that each power in government might be able to be a check and balance on the other. And so what we've done is we've put a great deal of faith in the rule of law, or the idea that the ideal of the rule of law might be able to be self-sustained if we only just establish a constitution that contains rules, and we set up some institutions that keep each other institution within the rules. Now, the problem, I think, at the heart of this idea, and the reason why I think we are seeing this unraveling, is that we've forgotten that for all of these systems of rules and for all of these institutional balancings that we institute through our constitutions and our legal systems, it still all depends on the individual character and virtue of the human beings that operate in those systems. And because we've forgotten that, because we've cut our cultures off from the sources of life in the community which generate good character, which challenge us each individually as to the integrity of our lives and our attitudes and our behaviour, what we do is we increasingly produce a culture in which people without character come into power and exercise it at their will. I think one way to illustrate this is that the rule of law was not in one sense a Christian idea. If we look at the work of Plato and Aristotle, we can see that they, and particularly Aristotle, understood the benefit of the rule of law. And what is also true is that they understood the importance of personal character and virtue for the maintenance of a just and healthy society. However, what I think the lessons of classical times taught early Europeans and the civilization that we have inherited is that even that is not sufficient to sustain itself. We know the stories about the way in which democracy declined in the Greek cities and in particularly in Athens. We know the moving story of the trial and execution of Socrates, where effectively we had an instance of mob rule lead to his conviction and execution and death. We also know the decline of the Roman Republic from some of the high ideals of the Roman Republic that jurists like Cicero maintained and endorsed and supported. But we know that it proved unable to sustain itself and declined very rapidly. It had some, Augustus, for example, tried to restore the Republic, but in doing so took onto himself the reins of extraordinary power. And from that time onwards, one can see, despite some high moments in the imperial history, essentially an empire that was based on conquest as the great St. Augustine pointed out, but secondly saw a decline in the quality and the character of its emperors, and then a decline in the character and quality of its people. And it was into this context, as we know, that Christianity, in what we know now as Europe, was born and grew. And what Christianity contributed, I think, to what was really a decaying civilization were many things of the nature that David's drawn attention to. And essentially and importantly, the institution of the church, which was understood by Christians to be a political community within a political community, but importantly, one that ought to be committed to the development of good character and the development of virtue in its members, and the service by those members into the community in the form of welfare, hospitals, care for the poor, and those sorts of things. And I think that the church on the whole, while not without its faults, transformed the nature of classical civilization from the inside. Now, there's many, many other things that came to mind as I listened to David's talk, and there's quite a lot of other things I think I'd like to say if I had time. But one other thing that I'd like to draw attention to, and this is jumping actually much more closely to our own time, and that is the influence of the evangelical revivals of the, I don't know exactly how I should date this, but the evangelical revivals that gave us what we know as the Victorian era. I'm becoming increasingly intrigued by the significance of the waves of evangelical revival that happened in England and the United States and spread from there to many, many countries under that influence. And what I think is something that is highly supportive of David's thesis is an argument made by Professor Robert Woodbury of the National University of Singapore a few years ago, published in the American Political Science Review. And let me just say incidentally, that's one of the two leading political science journals, not just in the United States, but in the world. And this article that Woodbury had published, for that reason, went through the most excruciating level of peer review that can occur, and my understanding anecdotally went through enormously increased scrutiny. Robert Woodbury's, the title of Woodbury's article is The Missionary Roots of Liberal Democracy. And what Woodbury shows through very detailed argument that democracy and the rule of law throughout the world has been affected by Protestant missionary work throughout the world, and that the effect of the Protestant missionaries in the world has been the single most significant factor influencing the quality of democracy and the rule of law that exists in a country. I welcome you to find the article and read it, and you will see how extraordinarily thorough his research and argument is. It's contained, as I said, in the American Political Science Review, and it was published in 2012. He argues that the missionary work was a crucial catalyst in initiating the development of things like religious liberty, mass education, mass printing, newspapers, voluntary organisations, and colonial reforms, and that it explains almost half the variation, so it's the biggest explanatory factor of the quality of democracy in the rule of law throughout Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Oceania. And it's based on the basic, as it were, variable in his analysis is the number and reach of Protestant missionaries in the country according to international data. And if I recall correctly, it's 1915, which is a date at which he has very useful data. And when you look at the number of Protestant missionaries in a country as at that date, and a whole lot of other data of a similar nature, that is the single most significant predictor of the quality of democracy and the quality of the rule of law in the country. And Woodbury argues that the reason why this might be the case is that Protestant missionaries, when they came into a country, among the many things that they did, sought to convert the population, not by force, but by good works and by proclamation of the gospel. And they sought to persuade by their words and their deeds, their good deeds. And that in such a context, and given the effect of the gospel in those societies, it transformed the societies to the extent that this penetrated. Because even those who might hold different religious views, and with all due respect to other Christian denominations in this context, it encouraged a culture where if you are going to respond to the missionaries, you respond in the same way that they were acting. And that is to redouble your own efforts in providing good works and in arguing your case in words and in language. And this then, Woodbury argues, contributed to a culture where open debate and discussion under the rule of law thrived, and these conditions supported the development of democracy and the rule of law in those countries.
Well, Professor Aroney, we're
That's
just about out of time.
Very significant argument that Woodbury makes here, and I think it's worth considering. So there are many other things that I'd love to say about David's paper, because I found it very provocative and interesting, but I thought I might leave those observations with you at that moment. So thank you very much.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Professor Aroney. It was lovely to hear your thoughts. And there's obviously a huge amount that we need to consider thinking about, and it might be good to provide a link in the email to that article, the 2012 article. Let's get through a couple of questions, David. There's one from South Australia here, the watch party there. Victoria has now criminalised prayer and counselling. Apart from Nazi Germany and communist states, have such laws ever been enacted in Western societies?
Yes. When, for example, I'm from Scotland, the Scottish Covenanters, when we were told how we should worship and they sought to impose that, and we had bishops imposed upon us. Sorry, Sydney Anglicans. You know, no, states have done that. This is, but it's not right. I mean, that's a really good question from Adelaide. One of the good things is that we're not lost yet, and I think there is opportunity for us just to get this main idea back. We tend to get caught up in secondary issues, even though they're important. It's the primary issue that really matters. Can I just add just something to what Nick Aroney said in terms of Plato and so on? I'm not arguing that it's in the Christian church. I'm arguing Christianity derives from Judaism and so on. It's God who's the ultimate source. I agree with Nick about character, but I think the ultimate source is justice is from God, not human beings. And very interestingly, Plato especially is virtually 100% certain that he was hugely influenced by Moses. And I think that the civic laws and so on you find in the law, the Torah, is really important. And by the way, Plato, Aristotle, in terms of character, well, they're big supporters of slavery. In fact, they argued it was a human right to have slaves. And there were lots of other issues as well involved in there. So, but anyway,
sure, we might come back to a couple of those issues. There's a few questions there. There's one question here from Canberra. In Australia, is the limiting of funding to courts strangling justice and denying justice to people? In one sense, emasculating society's access to justice?
Oh, definitely lawyers should be paid triple. I actually don't know the answer to that. But no, I just don't know. I mean, if you're going to have a justice system, you have to fund it. But I suspect that what's strangling things much more is the confusion between regulations and laws. I think people should be able to make regulations that if you make everything a crime, then you're going to end up with almost either nothing is a crime or only selective people will get prosecuted. That's the danger. The danger is some people get prosecuted for doing some things, and other people don't get prosecuted for doing the same things.
Okay, all right. A question here from a watch party in Sydney. Is the good character necessary for the rule of law? Is that possible without acknowledging the need for turning to God? So this is really going to your main point.
Well, I would be really, really careful, because that borders into the lines of only Christians can be moral. And that's not true, because by definition of being human, we're made in the image of God and we are moral. And we're a mixture, you know, there's good and bad in all of us. But to be honest, there are those of you who are Christians who will recognize this. There are people who profess to be Christians and you think, am I really on the same team as them? And then there are other people who are not Christians, and in terms of integrity. And so Cornelius, for example, the centurion in the Bible, I mean, he was a God-fearing man, but he certainly wasn't a believer in Jesus, but he was considered to be an upright and good man. So I'd just be really careful about making that argument. If only people were Christians, then we would be more moral, and therefore we would have better laws. I'm not entirely convinced of that. I think human character, the character of the judge is absolutely essential. The character of lawyers is essential. But, you know, you could have somebody who was, in one sense, a good lawyer who's a bad person. And you could have someone who's a good person who's a bad lawyer.
All right, we've got a question here that it goes to really why you're in Australia, David, coming from your homeland of Scotland. That is it possible to reliably reverse the slippery slope that the UK and USA are on? Some assumptions in that question, but why are you here? What have you seen?
It is. I know it's interesting you phrase it that way. I think it is. I think the US is too far gone, actually, and the structure within the US and everything else. I think the US is heading towards some kind of anarchy and collapse. But that may be wrong, but I've thought that for about 20 years, and so far I've not been proved wrong. The UK, I mean, by definition, what Nicholas said about revivals and so on, that's what happened in the UK. That's what happened in the US. We'd been here before, actually, in some ways. But I think that's what it's going to take now in both the UK and the US. I think in Australia, it's somewhat different, because I think Australia has certain advantages. One of which is that it's also an indigenous and an Asian country, as well as being a kind of Western European style country. I also think that Australia is not as far down the road as the UK. And maybe having said that, having watched the drum last night, I'm beginning to revise my opinion a little bit. You're heading our direction extremely quickly. And unless you start challenging things, and it's the elites, it's not ordinary people. It's in the academy, in the corporations, and in some sections of the media. But if Australia can retain a free legal system, in other words, one that's free of political control, and a free media, and the church can be renewed, then I see great hope for Australia. Yeah. I'll do.
Okay, thank you. We're just about out of time. Probably squeeze in one more question. Is the term Judeo-Christian ethic offensive to Jews?
You need to ask Jews. The Jews I've spoken to, not at all. It's impossible for a Christian to be anti-Semitic because we worship a Jew, and all the apostles were Jews, and the basis of law and legal system and everything comes from the Old Testament. So I don't know. I mean, to be honest, I think any word, my view now is that any word that I say at any point will be found to be offensive by somebody at some point. So if it offends you, do you know this? I actually don't care. I'm fed up. I'm offended by people who constantly get offended. So if you want to avoid offending me, don't say that you're offended by anything. Sorry. I hope you don't find that offensive,
Okay.
Peter.
All right.
But
Thank you. Okay. All right. Well, look, we're right out of time, but let's thank David for his efforts here this morning. Let's join a round of applause for him.